budget is not just a collection of numbers, but an expression of our values and aspirations. Good evening. Dr. the Honourable Nigel Clarke, you are valued support and stakeholders. And then Robert, our the This evening we gather at the regional headquarters of the Ministerial budget breakdown, a unique analysis of the budget and the The last time we had the honour of having Minister Clarke at the live event with us, it was a rainy night for the location at one point in time, the Minister was standing before the Thursday night. Dr. Clarke's observation brings to the fore some of the free of the only independent public policy agency in this country has a privilege and responsibility to accessible, objective information on economy, governance, environmental policy, and social issues. We do not take this lightly. Each knowledge project editorial diligence of the relevant data and rigorously through these efforts, we fulfill our commitment to the CAPRI education and public policy. Yet this objective remains secondary to our primary informing public policy, evidence and formula. For the next 16 years, we have been supporting sound data-driven policy. In 2022 alone, we published 11 reports covering financial inclusion, vaccine hesitancy, budget transparency, gender-based violence in media coverage. First time ever, we calculated the cost of countries carrying obstacles, 15.5. As we continue our work on the economy, governance, environment, and social issues, and long before ESG was a thing, we have already intensified multi-branch studies on gender wage gap, the relationship between productivity and political obligations, and workforce status. Under a grant from the European Union, one of our most steadfast supporters, the environment, social rates, and evaluating the cost of that grant. Later this year, we will launch a 3-year study project on urban youth technology, funded by the School Program and Button, in collaboration with Additionally, we are incubating studies on education policy, financial crime investigation, marine economic value reporting, and a significant portion of the population outside the labor market to see how they feel and especially cutting with an access to the unseen type of installed individuals. We have engaged in capacity building for other civil society organizations, balance prevention, and policy. We are active members of regional and global think tank organizations, Southern Voice, we are promoting dialogue and presentation with partners, and we are exploring opportunities for private health in the breadth of our endeavors is extensive, and I could go on, but time is limited, and I know you're eager to learn the presentation and subsequent discussion. Here's how it's done. At the outcome, founders and established undergraduates, we will extend the presentation report. The report, research team led by the team of Diana Sanders and Amber Taylor, and will maintain the following the report presentation of the strategy and delivering the moderating payments to you are seeing audience area slido.com and enter the event code. Send your question, update the ones you would like to see. For those present here at the exhibition headquarters, if you would like to ask a question personally, please identify the number here. We will call on you for the question. And we repeat it. And that's pleasant presenting. That's the time.
Okay. At precisely 12:30 p.m. on Friday, November 20, 2011, on the 5th floor of the Gleaners North Street headquarters, a foundation, CAPRI, the redoubtable Oliver Clarke of blessed memory, called to order a discussion forum among a group of Jamaicans resident in Jamaica and from. The discussion was taking place ahead of the December 29th general election, but it was also taking place in the context of the Greek debt crisis. Just a few weeks earlier, the Greek Prime Minister had called for a confidence vote and a referendum to approve an EU summit deal which involved debt relief for Greece, but also required a 50% haircut on Greek government bonds. In 2011, the debt to GDP ratio in Greece was 175%, as was Japan's. After these two countries, Jamaica had the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world at about 140%. But Jamaica did not have Greeks' access to European Union funding, nor was its debt primarily denominated in local currency, as was the case of Japan. Consequently, although Jamaica in 2011 was the world's third most indebted country, it was also the most fiscally vulnerable country in the world. Against this background, there was much pessimism among the discussants. There were concerns about the fact that Jamaica faced an apocalyptic future. It was potentially heading to general elections with no or very few options. Into the discussion fray entered another CAPRI director, Dr. Damian King. Dr. King, as quoted by the Gleaner in the article that was presented to the public on the 27th of November, stated, and I quote, I do not share the view that Jamaica is teetering on the brink of an economic collapse, similar to the recent debacles in Europe. The country had options and could pull itself out of the political, economic, and social quagmire that had dogged it for decades. But Dr. King was not suggesting the absence of a crisis, but rather the current crisis, echoing the US politician, Rahm Emanuel, should not be wasted. He went further. We have wasted every crisis. We wasted the inflation crisis of the early 1990s. We wasted the financial crisis of the late 1990s. We have wasted the fiscal crisis we have had every 2 years over the last decade, instead of using these crises to say, here is what we must and need to do. In this perspective, King was joined by another foundation, CAPRI direction, as quoted by the Gleaner, we fall over the edge. If we position that it is so hopeless that there is nothing we can do, we have lost the battle already. I am convinced that with appropriate policy decisions and with appropriate support, we can make significant changes. The Gleaner, in reporting on the discussion, had a choice to make in terms of how it positioned the proceedings from the fora for the Jamaican public. The choice the Gleaner took was to take the optimistic perspective that had been articulated by the CAPRI directors. And so the Gleaner's lead story in relation to this discussion forum on the 27th of November, 2011 was, we won't fall over the edge. But the Gleaner understood that, as did the commentators at the forum, that this was not a statement that one could make without recognizing what needed to be done to ensure that we didn't, as a country, fall over the edge of the precipice. And so the Gleaner's editorial on the 27th of November, 2011, was that the economy must be the election talking point, and then went on to posit that we needed, as a country, to have a far-reaching consensus on the importance of fiscal reform in our country to ensure that we did not fall over the edge of the precipice. The perspectives of the CAPRI representatives, both in their act of hosting the discussion and providing an analysis focused on solutions that were within the control of Jamaicans, largely represented the underlying philosophy that drove the establishment of CAPRI and its predecessor institution, the Jamaican Economy Project. And that philosophy was captured in the institutional slogan, taking responsibility. It is a philosophy that proposes that Jamaica's relative underdevelopment, in tennis parlance that the Clarks, Oliver and Nigel, understood well given their tennis pedigree, is more associated with Jamaica's history of unforced errors rather than its inability to hit winners. We now know that Jamaica followed the principle of dealing with its history of unforced fiscal errors through a bipartisan approach to fiscal policy reform, supported by carefully structured efforts to build a national consensus around the fiscal reform agenda. And the efforts have been dramatically successful. Jamaica's fiscal position is significantly better than it was in 2011. And it would be easy for there to be the declaration of victory. Colleagues, my suggestion to us tonight is that such a declaration would be inappropriate and indeed far too early in our journey. We are now seeing the dividends associated with Jamaica's improvement in its macroeconomic stability foundation. The face of Jamaica is being transformed in infrastructure, in construction, We have seen the most comprehensive salary compensation process that has ever been undertaken in Jamaica, with the largest increases in compensation that public sector workers have ever seen. And that process was joined yesterday with quite possibly the largest parliamentary compensation increases that have ever been seen in Jamaica. So we're seeing the dividends. But it is so important to note that Jamaica's success to date in fiscal reform should not lead to the presumption that fiscal prudence is irreversible. And just as importantly, although Jamaica has seen a significant improvement in its fiscal affairs, if you take a look at Jamaica's 23, well, I guess it's 2022, since that's the latest data we have, is 2022 per capita income. The 5,000 plus figure is essentially identical to what it was in 2011. Jamaica has reaped fiscal reform success, but the Jamaican economy is not in a significant better shape in terms of income levels than it was in 2011. What is the implication of that? Well, let's just take it on the issue in relation to compensation levels. Compensation levels in Jamaica, many would argue, were woefully inadequate, both at the level of the public sector bureaucrats and at the level of the parliamentary ministers, and the permanent secretaries, et cetera, et cetera. And there has long been call for an improvement in those compensation levels. There was a committee that was established in 2003, 20 years ago, chaired by the redoubtable Oliver Clarke of blessed memory. And he proposed that there needed to be both a significant adjustment in parliamentary compensation levels and a change in the orientation where compensation levels would be more attuned to market demand factors, to performance levels, et cetera, et cetera. But those compensation levels that we are now arrived at have to be supported by the same economy that existed 12 years ago. So herein lies the challenge. The challenge is that as Jamaica starts to reap the dividends of the fiscal reform program, it is absolutely important for Jamaica to understand that its fiscal prudence stance is reversible. And as a consequence, as we seek to improve the welfare of all Jamaicans, we must recognize that if this is not done in a carefully organized, structured way that takes account of the economy's ability to pay, even while seeking to position the economy so that it can track the skills that are needed to improve its performance, we have to make sure that we don't return to the fiscal imprudence that existed for many years in the country. And I want to return to the linkage between unforced errors in tennis, because there is a tendency definitionally to contemplate that unforced errors are errors that lie entirely within the control of the tennis player, and they really aren't forced by circumstances. A classic unforced error is a double fault, where you don't get the ball into the box on 2 tries. But many double faults are actually quite forced. Your opponent takes an aggressive return stance, or your opponent has hit your last 2 second serves for winners. And so you are seeking to ensure that that doesn't happen again. It's important for us as a country to understand that the challenges of our past were not because of a lack of good intention by our policymakers and our leaders. So we can look back to the periods in the 1970s and 1980s, the period Dr. King described, and incidentally, Daniel, the Gleaner article that carried your remarks had this classic stance of you with your two hands on your head like that. And I like to remember and think about the fact that this was not out of desperation, but your frustration because we hadn't taken advantage of the crises of our past. But it's important for us not to think about that was yesterday and it can't happen again, because those people were ill-intentioned. They didn't know what they were doing. They really weren't putting Jamaica first. All of that is not true. In many respects, they were forced by the circumstances around them, the poverty levels, the challenges to try to improve welfare so quickly that it occurred in the context of instability. Our policymakers today, and I really want to laud our Minister of Finance in particular on this front, have recognized the potential reversibility of our fiscal prudence. And so there is an effort to institutionalize fiscal prudence and also to institutionalize monetary policy independence and effectiveness, because the other leg of our instability problems in Jamaica was a constant long-term period where the Bank of Jamaica was supporting reckless fiscal positions of the government. And again, I use reckless not in a derogatory way, but in contrast to a studied, carefully considered process that looked dynamically at what was happening. So we have also focused on legislating our fiscal prudence, but the challenges of our neighbor to the north is an ever-present reminder that legislation, fiscal legislation, can be gamed. Jamaica focused on anchoring the economic recovery program after COVID-19 on a foundation of macro stability. And this was an important part of the principle that guided Dr. Clarke as he so ably chaired the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Task Force. And so even in the midst of a pandemic, while we sought to ensure that there were efforts to improve the welfare of all Jamaicans in the face of an incredible exogenous shock, the recommendations of the task force were anchored on the importance of maintaining macroeconomic and macro-social stability. So, how do we, as a country, help to create an environment where there's a recognition of the reversibility of fiscal prudence, but also of the importance of never going down that path again? Well, we need independent institutions who can analyze the government's budget and can interface with the public and provide an assurance that we're going down the right fiscal direction. One such institution that Dr. Clarke has championed and is about to come into its own, having the country having appointed its first fiscal commissioner, is the National Fiscal Commission. And its fundamental reason for existence is to provide an independent voice in relation to the country's fiscal affairs. But you need other voices as well. And indeed, you need voices that are not affiliated with the government. And are there such entities around? Well, the reason we're here in this room today is because CAPRI has demonstrated its independence, its willingness to engage in appropriate research and to interface accordingly with the public on key matters. And that is the reason why CAPRI has annually had a budget review process. My parting remark in relation to CAPRI is that as we engage in this process of budgetary analysis, it is so important for our analysis to be dynamic, to contemplate as we look at today's budgets and the expenditure elements associated therewith, to look carefully at what are the implications of today's decisions for tomorrow's budget, next year's budget, next decade's budget. And interestingly, of course, public sector compensation features very importantly in such an analysis because of the geometric progression elements associated with compensation. When they are changed, there's very little ability to reduce them if there are challenges to the economy, and we have seen that in the past. And again, one of the things our current policymakers have tried to do is to put in place a policy framework, and again, I applaud you, Minister, because you have been at the forefront in this process, of trying to ensure that we have some insurance in relation to potential exogenous shocks so that we don't overly run the risk of some major climatic or other shock to the economy that really puts our fiscal position in a state of absolute desperation. So this is why we're assembled here today, colleagues. We have a story that's a good story to tell, but it's an incomplete story. It's a story that does not yet show that Jamaica has turned the corner in terms of its economic performance, its technological performance, its ability to compete effectively in an increasingly challenging global economy. But we still have to make sure that we create the platform that allows the investment to take place, that allows the innovation to take place, that allows the technological upgrading to take place. And historically, all around the world, that platform has been a foundation of macroeconomic and macro-social stability. And our fiscal analysis that we do has to make sure that Jamaica continues the path of fiscal prudence, and we don't see a reversal of that position, and we understand that the potential for reversal is always very, very high in a low-income developing country because no one in the country feels that their very legitimate personal aspirations are being realized. And so managing that process is one of the fundamental challenges in the development equation. I'm happy to say that in Jamaica today, I see many individuals who are ready and willing to be a part of that fundamental management challenge. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wint, for so thoroughly establishing the framework for the presentation that Dr. King is about to make. Dr. King.
Very much, Diana. Thank you very much, Alvin. You've really framed the discussion we're going to have quite expertly. So we want to examine the implications of the budget that has been proposed, and in the context of salary increases for the senior administration officials, you know, it's an appropriate time for us to examine the minister's major contribution to economic policy annually to see if, well, he's worth the money. Let us get a methodological note out of the way first. Normally, when you're comparing the numbers in a budget, you do so in relation to previous years. But because of inflation, when you're comparing, say, a revenue number from 2017 to one in the newly proposed budget, you're really looking at economic values that are not comparable. Because the purchasing power of revenue of 554 billion in 2017, say, is not the same as the purchasing power of that amount of money in 2023. 554 billion in 2017 could buy a lot more goods and services than it can now. So what we do is an adjustment to past values, expenditure values, revenue numbers, to compensate for the loss of purchasing power to inflation in the intervening years. And what we do is we take the 554 and we say, what would it take to purchase the same amount of goods and services in 2023 because of the purchasing power lost to inflation? And when we do that adjustment, we get a higher number. So all the numbers that are analyzed and reported in this presentation have made this inflation adjustment. When we say total revenue of 911 billion compares to total revenue in 2017 of 796 billion, it's not because this was the money amount in 2017. The nominal amount was 554. But that is equivalent to 796 billion in today's money. So that is how we make these comparisons across disparate years. We're going to try to do three things in this presentation. First, we're going to look at the credibility and sustainability of the budget. Secondly, we want to examine what are the key trends, what are the major shifts that the budget numbers are revealing to us. And finally, we want to make some international comparisons. So we see how our budget exists in the context of like countries. So we start off with the issue of credibility and sustainability. When we talk about credibility, we're talking about, is there a reasonable likelihood that the budget numbers presented, the revenue and the expenditure, will materialize? If they are not plausible, then there's really no point in analyzing the budget. Those budget numbers, the categories of expenditure and the items of revenue, are based on assumptions about what is happening in the economy, what is going to happen in the economy over the course of the fiscal year. So, for example, the government has to make an assumption about the amount of economic growth it expects, because the more economic growth there is, the more economic activity is, the greater the amount of revenue it can expect. So one of the underlying assumptions of the budget presented is that economic growth is going to be 1.6 over the course of the fiscal year, 1.6%. They've also assumed that inflation is going to fall to 5.2% over the fiscal year. Again, that's going to affect the amount of revenue it can expect to receive, and therefore the amount of expenditure it can afford. So, are the numbers presented credible? Well, one way to examine that is to see if those assumptions align with independent forecasts. So we looked at the World Bank forecast for economic growth in Jamaica over the 12 months beginning in April, and the IMF forecast. And the World Bank and the IMF are independent institutions, independent of the government. And it turns out the 1.6% economic growth is actually within the range of those two institutions. Indeed, the IMF is forecasting higher economic growth than the Jamaican government is using. So the Jamaican government has made conservative expectations of economic growth. And so the numbers, the amount of revenue that they have forecasted based on economic growth, are credible. Another way of examining credibility is to look at recent budgets and to see the extent to which the outturn has actually been consistent with what was budgeted. And it turns out that in recent years, revenues have actually either met or exceeded the budgeted amounts, and therefore could have afforded the expenditure on which those budgets were made. And the final element of credibility is whether the budget numbers are resilient to shocks. So you can make a forecast, but the forecast applies under normal circumstances. But if circumstances are abnormal, then the forecast that you have made and the expectations that you have for revenue are not going to apply. And when you operate in a highly vulnerable economy, subject to external economic shocks, oil price changes, interest rate changes, natural disasters, this is an important element of credibility. Is there some resilience built into the budget? And our conclusion is there is more resilience built into this current budget than probably any previous budget, based on a number of considerations. For one, the net international reserves of the central bank, that is essentially the foreign exchange savings of the central bank, now stand at the equivalent of 5 months worth of imports. And the norm for what is adequate is actually 3 months. So there's a fair amount of savings in the kitty to handle unexpected economic shocks. The second element of resilience is that the Jamaican government has taken out catastrophe bonds. If a well-defined catastrophe occurs, all of the spending to cover that does not have to come from the consolidated fund of the government, from the bank accounts of the government. We get an insurance payout to cover those. And we have some over $300 million worth of those to take us through the hurricane season. And the third element of resilience really is not having a high level of public debt. If the government already owes a lot of money, its capacity to borrow more in an emergency is limited because lenders are going to be concerned about repayment. And with the public debt down to 80% of GDP currently, that actually has built in the capacity to increase borrowing in an emergency, as occurred during the emergency of the pandemic. So for all of that, we conclude that there is sufficient resilience built into the budget and that the government has promulgated a credible budget, a budget in which the estimates of expenditure and revenue are plausible and can be believed in. In Alvin's remarks, he spoke a lot about sustainability. He spoke about analyzing the budget not just in the context of the current fiscal year, but when you look at the proposed revenue and expenditure and the commitments, what are the implications of that for subsequent years, for the medium term and the long term? What does it say about revenue in the future and expenditure, and what is happening to the public debt and the economy? We're not going to go through a detailed sustainability analysis, but one key metric to know if a fiscal budget is sustainable is whether the debt is rising or falling. If it's not sustainable, then what it means is there's a fiscal comeuppance that's going to have to be faced in 2 or 3 years' time. If it's not sustainable, then it means if this year there are no new taxes, well, it's going to be next year that you're going to have new taxes, or the year after that. Well, we know that Jamaica is seeing a welcoming and impressive reduction in its public debt, coming all the way down 11 years ago from 145% of GDP, now at 80%. And the implications of the budget presented is that it is going to be down to 74% of GDP by the end of the fiscal year. So we conclude that given that trajectory, the budget presented is credible and sustainable. One implication of this, and one important implication, is the consequences for the share of interest in total spending. You know, there was a time when interest took up 40% of Jamaica's government spending. In fact, in 1 year, it was close to 50%. You don't have any space for public services, for expenditure on social services in that context. So one welcomed result of this fiscal responsibility has been the fairly consistent fall in the share of government expenditure going towards interest payments. And in the current fiscal year, it's projected to be down to a historic low of 17% of spending. We now turn to the second element of this discussion, which is what are the major shifts? What are the trends that we are seeing in the budget that we want to call attention to? There are three of them. The first one has to do with capital expenditure. Our longer fiscal history, starting from around independence, is that the country has consistently underinvested in infrastructure, in its economic infrastructure, in its roads, in its ports, in its public buildings. You know, I like to use the example of Flatbridge. All of the traffic between the capital city and the North Coast came down at one point to a single lane, not in each direction, for both directions, that was built for a horse and cart in the 18th century. And when previous governments were faced with that literal economic constraint, that bottleneck, the solution was a traffic light. It was, you must wait. So in that history of underinvestment in infrastructure, the capital expenditure of the government, of the budget, is a key metric that we need to look at. And in recent years, there had been a welcomed increase in capital expenditure. It was interrupted by the pandemic. But one takeaway from this budget is a return to significant levels of capital expenditure. Second takeaway is the growth of revenue, of total revenue. And here I remind you that the numbers presented on this chart are adjusted for inflation in the way that in which we started the presentation. So what this means is that the 911 billion of expected revenue in real terms, in purchasing power terms, is the highest, is the greatest amount of revenue that the country will have experienced. The third key shift is in terms of the source of revenue. Now, governments get revenue from outside of, miscellaneous sources and other category. There are three types of taxation, three types of taxes. You either tax income of individuals and companies, income taxes, or you tax production and consumption, value-added taxes, of which GCT is our primary example, or you tax international trade. You tax the goods as they cross the border, import duties and so on. And if you look at the shares of revenue that comes from each of these sources over the last 7 years, it strikes you that there has been a significant increase in the share coming from taxes on individual income and corporate income. So it's kind of worth, looking beneath that to see what is happening. The actual amounts of income tax revenue, again, in inflation-adjusted terms, shows a quite impressive increase in income tax revenue. Where is this coming from? We can identify three possibilities. The first one is more income tax from individuals. This is not a surprise because more individuals are working. Compared to 7 years ago, the employed labor force is 11% greater. If more people are working, then the economy has more personal income and more taxes are going to be paid. A second explanation is corporate income. Our company is more profitable. Now, we don't have any way of knowing what are the profit levels of private companies aggregated across the entire economy. But we can get that information from listed companies because their accounts are public. And when we looked at that, we were able to see, again, in inflation-adjusted terms, that the pre-tax net income of listed companies nearly doubled in the 5 years from 2017 to the most recent data we could find, for all of these companies, which is 2021. And there is no reason to think that this is only confined to listed companies, to publicly traded companies. So we conclude that higher levels of corporate income is one of the explanations for the growth in income tax revenue. The third source is the most interesting, and it is the erosion of the income tax threshold. The income tax threshold, the way the income tax structure works, is that on the first $1.5 million annually of income, you don't pay income tax. You don't pay the 25% income tax. You only pay income tax on any income you earn above that threshold, above 1.5 million. And we will recall that the income tax threshold was raised with great political fanfare in 2017 to 1.5 million. But over the course of the 7 years since 2017, inflation erodes the real value of that 1.5 million. Because as the prices of goods and services go up year after year, income levels follow it. Maybe not exactly, maybe not perfectly, but they follow it without there necessarily being greater purchasing power. So over the course of time, only because of inflation, incomes go above that threshold, even though the purchasing power of those incomes are not necessarily higher. So we examined how much erosion of that 1.5 million threshold has taken place since 2017. And it turns out that the purchasing power equivalent of 1.5 million 7 years ago is now only 1 million. So a third of it has been lost. And when we look at the amount of additional income tax revenue that is accounted for by only this factor, the erosion of the purchasing power of the income tax threshold, it accounts for about a quarter of the growth of income tax revenue. This will have implications. It not only has social implications about who you are taxing, what income brackets, but this is going to feed into one of the recommendations we're going to make later. We turn to the third element, which is international comparisons, which are always interesting to put Jamaica's experience in context. But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on only one of those comparisons. And it is the ratio of income tax revenue to GDP, to total production. This is a tricky measure because the tax to GDP ratio reflects, amongst other things, the competence of the government, the ability to extract taxation from economic activity reflects the nature of the economy and the competence of governments. There's a norm that the very minimum level of a country's tax to GDP ratio that allows the government to provide basic public services, basic public health, education, minimum maintenance of infrastructure, is 15%. If a country is not able to extract more than 15% of its output in taxes, it is a failed state, or it is bordering on a failed state. In that context, nearly all of the countries that we consider developed countries with efficient public administration systems have tax to GDP levels of greater than 30%. So we compare Jamaica to a bunch of middle-income countries, and this is where it came out in 2021, which means we are, near the top of the group of middle-income countries. You have to be careful how you interpret this. There are a lot of factors that affect the ratio of tax to GDP, having to do with the size of the size of your informal sector, having to do with the structure of your economy, and as I mentioned, the capacity of tax administration. So we don't want to overinterpret this. The average of these middle-income countries is 17%. So we're able to do better than the average. Coming out of this, we have two recommendations. Recommendations that we encourage the government to implement with its next budget. The first one is to correct for the erosion of the income tax threshold, which has moved a segment of the population which 7 years ago we decided to relieve from the tax burden, and only because of inflation, not because of a policy change, they have now been brought into the income tax burden. So to compensate for that loss since 2017, we recommend using part of the fiscal dividend from falling debt levels, from the fiscal responsibility that the country has exercised now for nearly 10 years. Using part of that dividend to raise the income tax threshold to 2.2 million. And the second recommendation is to get us out of the cycle of having, in real terms, in purchasing power terms, of having it fall for 7 years and then having a big adjustment and then falling again for 7 years, is thereafter to index the income tax threshold to the consumer price index, which is the measure of average prices of goods and services across the economy. So in real terms, it maintains a constant level. I leave it to you to judge whether, on the basis of this budget, he's worth the money. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. I'm going to use this opportunity to remind you how to pose your questions. Go to the Slido app, slido.com, enter event code CAPRI. I imagine there are already questions there. If you see questions that you want answered, you can vote them up. If there's a question that you want to ask, pose it. And if it's a good one, others will vote it up. And if you're here in the room with us and you'd like to articulate your question in person, please identify that in the question that you're here so that we can call on you to do so. Minister, Dr. King, Yenta.
Over next. You can sit right there.
Oh,
Yeah.
right, okay.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us on a Wednesday night this time. We're very happy to have you here with us. We want to go straight into the debate now.
A debate. Oh, now I see.
Minister, CAPRI's budget breakdown shows that inflation is projected to be 5.2% and economic growth is projected to be 1.6%. Yet our analysis shows that the IMF actually forecasts economic growth to be higher for Jamaica. Respectively, is this not a conservative estimate, or are you forecasting for resilience? Or in other words, are you under-promising in order to overachieve?
No, this is a very good question. Growth estimates are point estimates at the end of the day. There's always a distribution around a point estimate, and we make our sort of best assumptions given historical information, data that we have. And I should mention that the Planning Institute is responsible for the growth projection, along with the BOJ. The Ministry of Finance does not, project for its own budget, right? We see that as a little bit of a conflict, so we tend to receive the growth projection from those other organizations and interrogate them. But growth could, there's a range around the 1.6 that we could end up with. There are risks to growth, without a doubt. There are downside risks to growth. And I, mention one that, should have been obvious. What happens in the bauxite sector. We have, a very threatening court case, for example. We have had issues which have, underway to be resolved at Jamalco. The transition in ownership of the majority shareholder is positive for economic growth. So there are always risks, and maybe, it's our culture, certainly of this administration, to pay attention to the risks, because our history is one where risks have materialized. So I think the World Bank estimate is fair. I think the IMF estimate is fair. And it's a point estimate, and it's our best point estimate, under the circumstances.
Our minister mentioned about risk there, and I wanted to bring up the point you raised about debt to GDP. As you mentioned, the ratio is projected to fall from 80% to 74%. Can you explain why is this significant? And what does it mean for Jamaica to reduce its debt to GDP?
Well, let me first say that when you look at it only in terms of numbers, that alone does not sort of give you an appreciation for the scale of the achievement. I am hard-pressed to find an example of a country that has reduced its debt from 145% of GDP, anywhere in that range, and cut it down by almost half now without defaulting on principal. And so that the reason why that scale of achievement is so important is that, as alluded to in the presentation, that is the amount of revenue that you have discretion over is not that great. The minister doesn't have discretion over 100% of the revenue because, he has to pay salaries. He has to pay, rent on some of the buildings. So what you have left over to fix the roads, what you have left over to provide for public health is a small part of the budget. So the first thing that contracts or that has an inadequate amount of expenditure when you're devoting 40% of your expenditure to interest payments is schools, hospitals, roads, and infrastructure. it is the sort of signal example of this, and that is not obvious, is how, when you look at the number of streetlights that worked 7 years ago to the number of streetlights that work now, is because the government is able to pay its JPS bill. So it has a real consequence. Debt reduction is not just a number coming down. It has a real consequence for social services and for public services.
That's absolutely correct. You said it better than I can. When expenditure at $1 trillion allows for a very easy sort of explanation of the composition of the national budget. And a very sort of back of the envelope, sort of 1 minute version is of that $1 trillion, 367 billion for salaries, as Damien mentioned. We have no real discretion over that once the salaries are agreed. They have 300 billion for debt service, so that's 667 billion. Let's call that 700 billion for round numbers. You add to that 700 billion, 40 billion for pensions. You add 20 billion for the PATH program and all its dimensions. You're at 60. You add 15 billion for the subvention to our universities. You're at 775, I think. You add 10 billion for the university hospital. You're at 785. You add 12 billion for drugs through the health fund coming from the government support. You're at, all the way up there, I've lost count. You're at 787 billion. You add 8 billion for the subvention to the judiciary, to run the judiciary. You're at 795, I believe. You add 6 billion that we spend on roads and bridges. You're at 801 billion. Your capex is 75 billion, right? So that brings you to 875. You have 125 billion left for everything else. We have made a lot of progress, but things are, as Professor Wint mentioned, it's with space as tight as that, reversal is very easy. And that is why we have to be, given that we have experienced the benefits of reform in the expansion, in the improvement of the sort of physical and social infrastructure of the country, it behooves us to make every effort to continue with these kinds of priorities.
I'm very glad you raised the issue of expenditure. We also had a question in relation to the revenue. As we know, the ministry projects a record amount of revenue in the current fiscal year, with growth of 6.3% over the last year. But how has Jamaica benefited from these increased revenues without increases in taxes? And is this sustainable?
Right. So we have been able, by policy choice, to finance our budgets annually over the past 7 years without, or certainly over the past 5 years, without increase in taxes, and over the past 7 years without increase in net taxes. But that takes effort and determination. If you leave things to just sort themselves out, that would not be the result. We have chosen to do that because it is necessary to demonstrate to ourselves that you follow a responsible sort of fiscal path, and there are benefits from doing that. And the experience is different from the experience of being fiscally irresponsible. Now, one of the most visible memories of that irresponsible path, and I use that word, is that almost every year there'll be a new tax package. That is the most persistent memory that we have over the, if I would say, and over the the 26 years between 1990 or 1989, let us say, and 2016, there were probably 4 years where there were no new taxes introduced. And that is the Jamaican experience. It has been necessary to draw a line under the sand, demonstrate to the Jamaican people that that does not have to be our future. So it has been clearly, at some point that you might have to have one every sort of long period, but the idea of having tax increases every single year is abnormal. And what we're trying to establish is a new normal, and for that to become ingrained in the psyche and consciousness of the Jamaican people, that we can recognize abnormality when it, God forbid, if it were to ever appear.
And this is the reason why we begin every analysis of the budget with, is it sustainable? Because as the minister is pointing out, if every year you have to have tax increases in order to be able to finance your expenditure, then at some point, tax increases are going to be on a shrinking pie. You don't always get additional revenue when you increase your tax rates, because the taxation reduces the incentive to engage in the economic activity. So it is literally not sustainable to have new taxation every year. And if you have to finance some of it by additional borrowing, that is also not sustainable, because you get to a level of indebtedness where lenders are no longer willing to provide loans to finance your expenditure. So sustainability is the first thing you need to know about your budget.
Thank you, Damien. Minister, I wanted to go back to what you said about new taxes not being introduced and a new normal. Well, in a CAPRI's report, we have presented a new normal with the 2 recommendations we make. And we actually want to ask you here on the spot, would you commit to raising the threshold to benefit Jamaican citizens?
I must tell you, that is one of the most popular questions. I've said publicly it's something that we'd look at, and I'd be very sort of transparent about it. Raising the threshold by the amounts that are sort of proposed in the report, would be a very expensive undertaking. You'll recall that when the threshold was raised to 1.5 in over 2 financial years, 2017 and 2018, I believe it was, or 2016 and 2017 and 2018, it cost 2% of GDP. We had to split it over 2 years, and ultimately it had to be done on a revenue neutral basis, because you couldn't plug a whole of 2% of GDP into the fiscal accounts. So moving back, I'm not saying that what you have here is 2% of GDP, but it's going to be that's a big number. So again, whatever we do has to be sustainable. So it's something that we will sort of look at and sort of be transparent about the cost implications and how those cost implications could be absorbed.
One of the reasons behind that proposal, which was not articulated in the presentation, is particular to Jamaica's economy. And it has to do with the number of income earners that are not on the PAYE system, because they are partially or wholly in the informal economy, or not earning income in a way that it can be extracted at source by your employer. And so in the context of this economy, income tax is a really unfair tax that is paid by those who happen to have formal sector jobs, but not by those who don't have formal sector jobs. And bear in mind that when we say don't have formal sector jobs or are not on PAYE, we're not only talking about hustlers, who are earning relatively small amounts. You have own account professionals who have professional practices who are easily able to escape income tax. So part of the motivation behind the proposal is to eliminate the unfairness in what is fundamentally an unfair source of taxation.
Yeah, and in principle, I'm aligned with that point of view. I mean, the government is aligned with that point of view. That has been the policy approach. So but we just want to apply that policy in a way that's sustainable. So the work, I haven't sort of done the calculations. So I'm just giving you a principled response to say that the cost would be a factor. So first principled response is say that we're aligned with what with the thinking that you have shared today. However, we'd have to cost it and see how something like that could be absorbed. And just heads up that those are large numbers.
So what I understand the minister to be saying is that he will implement it to the extent that it is affordable within the context of the continued fiscal prudence that Alvin Wint has encouraged us to keep focused on.
That's a fantastic summary, Damien. And I will translate it once more that that alignment that the minister talks about is going towards this new normal that can serve Jamaican citizens and the economy.
Yeah.
I want to open up to the floor right now. I know we have 10 minutes left for questions and answers. So I can take 3 questions and there will be a mic going around. So I see one hand over here, if one hand over there. We can start. Who has the mic? Thank you.
I've heard calls.
If you could just introduce yourself and your question.
Hi, Danielle Goodman. I've heard some talk about participatory in people's budget. What could that actually look like now? Because it seems that if you've got so much income now and the possibility to do something with it, how will that be decided in line with actual people's priorities, and how would you find out what those priorities are? Could a participatory budget be an avenue of somehow that is done?
Thank you. First of all, I think I don't want the impression to go unchallenged that we have suddenly discovered all this revenue. That is just certainly not the case. The demands on expenditure continue to exceed sort of revenue intake by a far margin, and we have to, as you say, apply some prioritization to expenditure. Now, first, let me also say that policymakers are heavily incentivized to ensure that expenditure reflects the people's priorities broadly defined. They may not reflect the priority of a particular individual, but the policymakers collectively are in touch with a wide group of people, stakeholders, interest groups across the entire country. And our political system, the competitive nature of it, the robust nature of it, provides heavy incentives to ensure that expenditure is aligned broadly with priorities. However, having deepening participation in a way that's consistent with your question is a noble goal. I believe that we could start, by way of an example, by just saying, hey, this amount of expenditure, which would not be a terribly large amount in the context of overall expenditure, let us have some public engagement about how we want to use it. There are ways in which one could begin, but I wouldn't agree with the characterization that the process today is devoid of participation. The participation is indirect, but we could deepen it. I agree, but we'd have to do so in steps and in stages.
Well,
for example, okay. So go ahead.
Well, no, I was going to challenge that view because one of CAPRI's other annual exercises in relation to the government is we annually assess the government's budget process, not the budget numbers, but the budget process We look at transparency, we look at openness, and we look at participation. And what we have found, the greatest weakness in the budget process in the 3 years that we have done this exercise is the lack of formal mechanisms for public participation. It is the greatest weakness in the process. And so we think that there's a lot of room for the government, and we have made recommendations in those reports. There's a lot of room to provide mechanisms of public participation. And the internet makes it possible.
Yeah. So again, let me just say two further sort of responses to it.
The report is following the money, and it can be downloaded from CAPRI's website.
I described the amount of the budget resources that are, truly discretionary, which are a small part of the overall envelope, right? So in any event, you wouldn't be talking about the entire budget, you'd be talking about some piece of the discretionary amounts. But I'd want to take into consideration the concern that processes like that can end up having the exact opposite effect, because it ends up being the most organized groups, those who have the capacity to shout loudest, who end up dominating processes like that. The advantage of the process that we have of having 63 representatives in government, in parliament, on the government side, representatives from the east to west of the country who are able to represent the views of persons, for there to be debate and therefore to be analysis, has certain advantages that I would not want to lose. We have, and that's the topic for another discussion, about how, fiscal resources, the response of fiscal resources to the most organized. And we have seen it over a long period of time with respect to compensation. There is a reason why compensation at certain levels in the public service, have the deviation from market is not consistent across the spectrum, or was not consistent across the spectrum. The deviation from market was concentrated in certain areas on the spectrum. Why? Has anybody ever asked why? Because of how the advocacy is organized. There's nobody who is advocating publicly at certain elements of the spectrum. Let's leave it that. It's a very touchy issue. I don't want to go into too much. But that is a real example of how levels of political and social organization impact allocation of resources. And if before we raise education levels up across the country, making sure that we have understanding and so forth, what can end up happening is that the most organized groups, it becomes even more undemocratic, in that the most resource NGO funded from overseas, not even funded from Jamaica, etc., ends up commandeering, right? Because they're the most organized. So it sounds great, but I wouldn't throw away our representative process that we have, not just yet.
Minister Clarke, we've got some questions coming in online, and there's some disagreement on that process. And I'm very pleased that you said you'd be happy to talk about that with us again, because as we said, we have another hallmark publication which deals all about public participation. So this is an issue we'd love to continue the conversation on. And
so we accept your willingness to come back when we publish following the one in 2023.
Absolutely. But let me just say, we have made an effort to broaden understanding. We have published a citizen's guide to the budget for the first time. I think it was in 2019. We made another first to make it available electronically. And this year we started a program, Budget in Schools, where we're trying to bring a wider cross-section of Jamaican people into an understanding of the budgetary process. I think these are all steps that the country would have to take before, these kind of the importation of these initiatives that flourish in other countries. We have to consider the conditions in our own country in the adoption of policy and the importation of policy. So I'm willing to have a further conversation on it. I'm open to the ideas of the public and ideas of CAPRI.
In the interest of time, I'd like to take another question from the audience.
Hey, Moses. Minister, I'd like to know if you agree with Dr. King's assertion that some professional escape taxes, and if that is true, why is that allowed?
I think TAJ has done a great job over a number of years with the assistance of overseas partners in improving its effectiveness. And I think the numbers bear that out. I mean, and you have seen in the newspaper of, TAJ sort of pursuing persons to the, and at the ultimate end of that pursuit, if there's no success, taking people to court. I think if you're sort of paying attention, there have been a number of those just in this year, 2023. So it's not what it would have been 10 or 15 years ago, but there's probably still work to be done.
I don't see any other questions from the floor, so I'm going to take one from our online audience member and come back to you. So Marvin says, Jamaica's Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, is very high. How does the budget tackle this issue, and what are the social implications?
That's a good question. So the budget makes allocations for social expenditure, and we have social expenditure across in many different forms. The PATH program, we would have provided increases for PATH beneficiaries and introduced a number of new programs within our expenditure, and tried to as well improve and increase targeting, which is always an important part of any sort of social safety net system.
The main reason, though, for the persistence of inequality is that there are large segments of the population which don't have the educational and skill levels to be able to sell that to the economy and earn an income from it. So it really reflects the inadequacies of the educational system in the previous generation, and those inadequacies still exist. So the way for the budget to tackle it, but not tackle it immediately, to solve the problem for the next generation, is to allocate increasing amounts to improving the quality of education.
I see Minister nodding in agreement.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we advocate so hard and make kind of tough decisions all the time to have a sustainable fiscal position, not as an end in itself, but as a means to an end, as a means to improving and increasing the fiscal space that we have to spend in ways that improve quality of life and improve life chances. That's what this is all about. These metrics are important, but they're not important in themselves. They're important because of what it will allow us to do on behalf of the people. And the great thing about the Jamaican story is that we've been able to demonstrate in real time improvements for various stakeholders and citizens from different demographic groups in the form of public investment expenditure that improves quality of life, in the form of the removal of distortionary taxation, in the form of being able to plan for the future and have a stable environment, and many other ways. And we are just highly motivated to maintain that posture because of what it means. And as Damien says, and I absolutely agree with, the most important area that we can allocate fiscal resources to for a transformation is in the education sector. I just want to just make one sort of final point, that None of this is automatic. And we make a terrible mistake if we believe that it is. That somehow we can sit back because of what we did last year, or what we did 5 years ago, or what we did 10 years ago, and dividends, just to borrow a word, will just continue to flow. That's a very dangerous assumption. This requires work every day because the unforeseen is always around the horizon. For the past, Jamaica has, for the past 10 years, 10 fiscal years, set a fiscal target and met it. 3 years under the previous administration, and with the 2023 target, 7 years under this administration. I can say to you that meeting the target in a year like this year, meaning last year, when we are in live negotiations for a compensation restructuring, when we have arrears issues to deal with, etc. Meeting a target under those circumstances, when we have this COVID recovery, which is unpredictable, really, is a Herculean task. And as a society, I think one of the most, in terms of just on having a fiscal conversation, I'm not saying this is the most important thing in the entire world, but within the space of discussing fiscal affairs, one of the most important things is for us to not take that for granted and to recognize that it's not automatic and it can very easily slip.
Minister, thank you very much. You mentioned the Herculean challenge ahead of us. I would like to mention Frantz Fanon and what he reminds us, that every generation must find its mission and fulfill it or betray it. Our report, presented by our director, Dr. Damien King, today showed that your budget is in fact sustainable and it's credible. However, we challenge you to go further in something that you've quoted could be a new normal. So we have challenged you here today to take up our recommendations that the income threshold should be increased, the income tax threshold, and that it should be pegged to the consumer price index. And we look forward to following up on further budgetary issues with you. Thank you very much for your time here tonight. Thank you to you, our audience, in person and online. And I will invite Diana for closing remarks.
As we come to the close of this event, I would like to express our sincerest gratitude for your presence and engagement with us. Driven by the premise that the budget is not merely a collection of numbers, but a reflection of our values and aspirations, CAPRI has presented its take on what we consider are the key insights and implications of the most recent budget for our economy, governance, and society. And we have had the privilege of being able to discuss these face-to-face with our Honourable Minister of Finance and with all of you. Minister, we thank you for your continued commitment to transparency and accountability and for engaging with us and with the Jamaican people. Your frankness and clarity have illuminated our understanding and inspired us. This is what evidence-informed policy research looks like. This is what public participation in the policy process looks like. And this is what CAPRI remains steadfast in its commitment to doing. We can only do this with the support of the University of the West Indies, the several good Jamaican corporate citizens who sustain us and are happy to do so with no strings attached, the donor partners and international foundations who consider us worthy to do this work, and the stakeholders and decision makers who understand and appreciate our mission and who extend themselves to us to be interviewed, to provide us access to data, and to lend us real-world perspectives into the questions we ask. This report and event were the outcome of a true CAPRI team effort, and I'm proud to count myself among this dedicated group of people who are always endeavoring to learn better ways of doing the work we do, who stay to the last to ensure the work is done and done well, and who remain enthusiastic no matter how much work we take on. Lastly, but most importantly, we express our gratitude to each and every one of you. Your presence, participation, and engagement are invaluable in creating a vibrant and inclusive dialogue and inspiring us to do what we do. As this event comes to a close, let us carry with us the knowledge and insights gained tonight. Let us continue to champion evidence-based decision-making, open dialogue, and promoting policies that reflect our collective values and aspirations. I invite you to join us for some light refreshments in the foyer right outside this room before you go off to what I hope will be a good evening.